Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Blaster Master 02. In the last part we finished our duties on planet Montoj. Mostly we did miss a singular planetoid map in there that I talked about last time, so very quickly we're gonna head back in and grab it. You might notice though there are two icons there that were grayed out. The way you access that little menu, by the way, is just by pressing X. Whenever you're on top of a planetoid, it'll show you any of the items within them. The thing on the bottom right, I don't think we're able to get until a good while later in the game. Not because we don't have a certain power-up, you just need to progress further in the game for the ability to get that to be unlocked. Those are essentially the side quest thing I very briefly talked about early on, but we'll talk more about that in detail when we get there. By the way, I haven't mentioned it yet. These cutscenes where the GAIA-SOPHIA is about to land on the planet and all that, they are technically loading screens, yes, but you can skip them at basically any point in time. The main reason I let them go is mostly because I kept forgetting to do that because I usually use those moments to either take a drink or look at my notes. So here on Planetoid B1, we need to ascend through this particular corridor between the spikes using the wall jump along the way. Hit that switch and your reward is a new sub-weapon for Jason the Flash Sphere, landmine that explodes to deploy an energy sphere. This thing's a little awkward to work with. Essentially you launch a small orb-like mine that can pass through, by and large, anything, and it'll detonate after traveling a set distance in front of you, contact, or by pressing the sub-weapon button again. Whenever you detonate it, there's just a lingering sphere of energy, sort of like X's plasma shot in Mega Man X.4 with that one particular buster part, that will continually damage enemies that are on top of it for apparently about 3 times the standard G-Blaster level 1 damage per second. You can only have one active at a time though, so be careful of that. It has its uses in some rooms. I tend to, again, ignore because I feel the obligation for some reason in a lot of this game, especially early on, to just use the base grenades. And I think it's just because of a level of comfortability I have with them at this point, on top of them being familiar from Blaster Master 1, 0, 1, and well, basically any other game that has the top-down stuff, really. Now, to slightly get ahead of ourselves, back in Blaster Master 01, in order to see every cutscene, you needed to 100% every area of the game. You don't need to do that to see every cutscene in this game, but if no matter what, if you don't care about the side stuff, I always recommend you still do this planetoid, because the reward from it is extraordinarily helpful on fresh playthroughs, on repeat runs, anything, especially if you're a more reckless, aggressive playstyle like I tend to be. If you're more defensive, it's still good then. Just make sure you grab the key in the center of that area, because otherwise you have to backtrack like half the area back down. That's just kind of annoying at that point. Because up here at the top of this area, we have what's known as the energy guard. This is extraordinarily handy because it actively impacts your gun meter and gives you a little bit of a room of comfort. Prevent your gun level from dropping when taking damage. Guard disappears after one hit but will regenerate again over time. So say now you have like the wave buster out like I do, and you just get hit, you won't immediately go back down to the charge shot as your max level. You have to get hit twice for that to happen. And even then, if you get hit once, you can take the moment to just run away and let that regenerate. Ever since we left Montoj, Eve has been spending more and more time in sleep mode. Eve's body is using Sophia's energy to keep the mutant corruption at bay. Because of that, she stays in Sophia and operates in energy-saving mode. Every new sub-weapon and maneuver we equip puts more pressure on Sophia's energy systems. Eve must be using her sleep mode to reduce that strain, but in exchange, it's likely taking a toll on her body. What's more, the further we travel, the stronger the mutants get. I need to find a way to increase Sophia's energy output. Well, maybe since you brought that up, it'll happen around here, Jason. The energy guard, though, by the way, I should mention this. I believe the timer for it regenerating is the same as it was back in Blaster Master 01, which is about 5 seconds after you get hit. Which sounds a little unmanageable, but most of the time, even in boss fights, as long as you get hit and then immediately just keep away from any further contact, like just immediately enter defensive mode, you can probably last until it regenerates no problem. So this is actually one of the few planetoids that actively has more than one item for us to grab, and the first one's just down here. Auto cluster. Consume SP to fire a terrain-piercing laser and cluster bomb simultaneously. Hold shoot to auto fire. This is the first complete replacement we can get for the Sophia's main cannon. Whenever you fire it, The front and main cannon of Sophia fires out a chain laser that kind of alternates in height and even has a chance of just firing out a higher power beam at random. Meanwhile, the back of Sophia throws out dynamite to keep your back covered. It's good for some situations. It does drain through your SP notably kind of quickly. It's kind of good for some crowd control and certain mini-bosses, but because of the somewhat random damage ratio, because of the randomness whether or not it'll fire a high damage laser beam or a low damage one, I prefer to stick with the standard G Crusher, if only because I can mash it and probably keep up with the exact kind of DPS that the auto cluster can fire out. Now, between parts, I actively did do a little research into how the Gaia system works in depth on the GAIA-SOPHIA here. Essentially, the amount of SP you regenerate depends on the height you fall. If you fall between 6 and 9 blocks, you regenerate 10% of your SP. 10 to 13 is 25%. In 14 plus blocks, you automatically recover the entire bar of SP by default. However, if you activate Hover in mid-air, that locks the amount of SP you'll generate at 10% no matter what. Additionally, activating any movement utilities, like the recoil jump, will completely cancel any regeneration you were going to make from that distance as well. With that said, the other method of regeneration we've seen is taking damage. You recover about 15% SP per hit. With that said, let's also talk about when the Sophia shuts down. When you use all your SP and shut down, you recover SP by default at about 10% a second, so about 10 seconds to max. But whenever you're in shutdown mode, any of the amount of SPs you would gain from a fall are doubled. So if you fall from like 14 plus blocks, that's now 200% of your SP recovered. So falls in that regard can be very effective when you're in shutdown. SP recovery from taking hits is also doubled in that form, so you recover about 30% per shot. Now, what's also kind of interesting, you may have noticed whenever I'm in shutdown mode, the GAIA-SOPHIA's shot just turns into a little baby wimpy laser. That does about 1/10 the damage of the normal G Crusher. But you may have noticed whenever I recover my SP completely, there's like a little shockwave around me. That's not just for visual, okay, you're ready to go kind of motivation. That actively does damage. It does a little over 2 times the damage of your normal G Crusher shots in tank form. And it can even knock some enemies off balance in some cases. So in some cases, going for a shutdown strat and then mashing into them until you recover can be a good thing. By the way, mini-boss here is the Mighty Mind Might. It is just a stronger variant of the enemy we've already encountered. But we're gonna get a different weapon for beating it. Counter blasts are still your best thing to do here, but you need to be careful of its mines this time because they don't only just explode, they leave a lingering fire effect that can of course damage you, so be careful of that. Grenades on top of things like the charge shots are very good here, same with the usual wave weapon, unless you're just very low on ammo like I am and have to rely on something else. The mines also do good damage too now I look at it. What's more interesting about this fight is the reward, because it's a cool thing on its own, but it actively ties into something I've been kind of holding off on talking about for a little bit now. I've said there's some functionality of the blaster rifle I'm not able to talk about yet, and that's because in order to activate those functionalities, you need certain sub-weapons. And the first one we're going to use for that is actively obtained from this thing as soon as we actively kill it. Come on, there we go. For beating this thing, you get the, I think it's just called the ignition bomb? Torch bomb, landmine that explodes into a burst of flame, works as a decoy. When I say works as a decoy, it means enemies will actively be attracted to it. It's the same as the proximity mine weapon, attack-wise, but it leaves a lingering fire effect. You can notably only have one of them on screen at a time, though, if memory serves, so be careful of that. Before I go back to that topic, time for our next planet. Is this the spaceship that was popping up on the radar? I believe so. This signal, somewhere on board is a module that could increase Sophia's energy output. Eve, don't push yourself too hard. Please, get some rest. Sorry, Jason. I just need a bit. Sleep tight, Eve. Hang in there till I find that module. I'm picking up multiple mutant signals aboard the ship. Not a single sign of life on board other than those. The mutant attack must have wiped out everyone and everything else. It'll be tough going on without Eve's assistance. But this is no time to falter. I'll take care of this on my own for Eve's sake. Oh, I'm sorry, Fred. It'll be the two of us, right, buddy? Frog, buddy! There's a module that increases Sophia's energy on this ship. I suddenly remember the time I first rode Sophia the Third in pursuit of Fred. Before I met Eve, it felt weird having an empty seat behind me in the cockpit. I get it now. A single person fighting the mutants on their own would easily get lost in despair. The support droids must have been made for more than technical support. Even having Fred here by my side makes me feel a little better. Actually, makes me feel a lot better. Frogs are friends. Go tap a frog. Don't actually tap frogs, that probably will give them anxiety. This planet can be a little bit different. A security barrier? The mutants managed to take over the ship's defense systems. Sophia isn't equipped to take on a huge mutant like that. Might be better to keep my distance for now. The best way I can describe this particular planet is that it's sort of a chaser scenario out of a horror game where this mechanical mutant in the background will be constantly trying to attack you using its drill hands. But you need to use those to destroy certain barriers in a way, so make sure you're actively, like, baiting it a certain direction. Watch out for hitting it, though, because those do a lot of damage to you. In some regards, that room always also reminded me of a very particular room from Metroid Fusion, when a certain enemy is just kind of roaming the background to try and scare you. When you're not being chased by the mutant, though, it's pretty standard stuff. Enemy cannons that you can shoot and all that. Don't worry too much about it. So, the Torch Bomb. I said it has a fire effect, and if you actively look in the sub-weapon menu, you'll notice it's a different color than all the other sub-weapons. That's because it's our first elemental one. It is just an out to the proxy bomb that has extra effects. But when you use it in tandem with certain blaster rifle levels, they will then gain those elemental effects. For instance, the level 1 G-Blaster rifle will just outright become a fire elemental weapon at that point. And fire elemental weapons can melt icy floors in the rare case you run into those, but they can also hit enemies and light them on fire, doing damage over time. The Splasher, the level 3 weapon, if the origin point of the entire set is over a Torch Bomb's flames, it'll gain those elements. The EX charge gets an interesting one. The charge shot will now explode a certain distance out or if it hits something, and that does about over 2 times the damage of a standard G-level shot. And that can still do the damage over time and do direct hit damage as well. You really want to experiment on a first playthrough with the elemental shots, because there are some enemies and bosses that even have direct, unique responses to certain elements. So in that regard, having those particular sub-weapons on, like, shortcuts can do a lot for Jason's survivability in some cases. I'll even showcase some of those throughout the LP. Only a couple, though, because there's some I didn't even know about by the time I was recording this. On my first playthrough, this planet was particularly anxiety-inducing because of A, the damage the boss mutant in the background is doing, yes, but also enemies around here that have that pink shield that is the same color as the barriers that Mecha Mutant was destroying for us. They take a lot of shots to take out. So this might be a case where you actively just want to focus on the platforming with the Sophia rather than actively fighting. This is meant to be a situation where you just run. Or at least run as fast as you can when you have to let a giant mecha destroy barriers. Around now, they start throwing the mecha's other arm type at you, which is a Gatling cannon, which isn't much to worry about, but be careful about aiming that at the barriers, because when the bullets hit the barriers in those cases, they bounce off, I think, somewhat randomly, either diagonally upwards or downwards, the opposite direction. And if you're up there or down there, well, you're probably going to be taking shots that make you just feel dumb for taking them. God knows that's happened to me a lot. The mixture of having to flee from this thing while also having to use it to your advantage to open barriers does feel a little awkward on some portions, I won't lie. But I think by the end of the game, at least on a first run, this is one of my favorite planets, if only because you don't need to worry about missing things nearly as much. The area is very linear because of this particular enemy mechanic. So you don't need to worry about going up, down, and all around in the case you're more into this for the A to B platforming and top-down action sequences rather than any kind of Metroid-like elements. If anything, thinking about it, it's actually kind of a little funny how Blaster Master 1 on the NES went from the very open-ended Metroid-like level design And then Blaster Master 2 on the Genesis went for more A to B platforming and all that. And then, weirdly enough, even though they do it completely differently in execution, Blaster Master 0, 1 to 2 do a very similar thing? Mind you, I guess that's also kind of in tone, because I mentioned back in Blaster Master 01's LP years ago that the lore for the Zero trilogy is sort of them making peace between both canons for the series before this, where there was sort of a lore for the series in the Western manuals and the Japanese manuals. And now they've just kind of combined them in a lot of ways that I think honestly works pretty well. Even though, for the most part, all it amounts to in, like, 01 is, like, seeing Kane's name towards the end. I think it ultimately does the most with that idea in 03. And that seems largely intentional for reasons we'll see when we eventually tackle that. Not sure when I'm gonna do that, though, because I've accidentally kind of alternated my Blaster Masters on this channel a little bit, where I did the NES game, then I did 0. Then I think I did 2 and Boy on the Game Boy. And now we're here with 02. So I think before I tackle 03, I might just try to tackle, like, at the least blasting again, and maybe the Wii one, the WiiWare one, if I can. Maybe even Enemy Below, which is the Game Boy Color version. That's by and large a remake of Blaster Master 1, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I like this series enough to cover every game if I can. Something that does start to come into play in this world, though, starting right about now, is I think this world's honestly a little visually draining to look at. It's not quite boring, it's just that it tires my eyes out, and I think it's mostly has to do with how the purples and oranges for the barriers and fires flash back and forth in some of these cases. It just gets to be a lot to look at, especially on larger TV screens. When I first played this game through, I think I played it mostly in handheld mode on my Switch, because that was around the time I still did that a lot. And it wasn't that bad then, but playing this on my rough estimate 35 to 42 inch screen, or viewing it in my video editor, it gets to be enough to cause some eye strain. And I mostly note this because I'm usually pretty immune to a lot of, like, visual strain like that. For instance, and this reveals a little bit about me that might make some of you judge me, I use Discord Light Theme. Not for, like, any kind of meme-y reason, it's because I actually can't read text nearly as well on certain dark themes. I get that particular, like, eye strain problem where white text on darker backgrounds will sometimes have that bleeding effect, and because of that, I don't like to be on a lot of dark modes. Unless it's an inherent dark mode that is a very certain contrast type, I tend to switch to light modes if they're not the default. Oh, also, you can shoot the hands backwards in the case you're trying to, like, avoid them, like in that previous area. There's not a lot of cases where you need to do that. In fact, if anything, that's the only one. But it's worth noting all the same, because otherwise you might take a lot of face-tanking damage there and probably get a game over. Thankfully, a death in this game does just send you back to the most recent checkpoint, which is seldom ever really that punishing. This particular cave, though, isn't much to write home about. This is mostly a restock area to start. But this is an area I recommend you use specifically EX Charge and Torch Bombs very often. Why? Well, I mentioned a few moments ago that there's some enemies that have distinct elemental weaknesses. The mini-boss here is one such enemy. An EX Charge just feels like the best way to use that outside of just the Torch Bomb itself. This is Unknown Cell 46. This is sort of a wave-based boss, where gel is gonna kind of come out of some of the walls and just go into you. But as you saw, by hitting it with a fire attack, I destroyed a large amount of the goop, and then we just have the nuclei left. And they're easy pickings at that point. Everyone you destroy drops an ammo capsule, so you can use even more torch bombs if you need to. If you don't use the fire attacks on them, which reduces them to just this minimal form, the gel will just slowly consume most of the field. I don't think it ever consumes all of it, but it does try to push you into a corner. Meanwhile, the nuclei will just try to shoot at you. And you can blast counter those, so that's a good way to kind of keep things on their toes and potentially stun it for a second, I think. But as you can see, fire damage is just absurdly good here. Not a lot of bosses have elemental weaknesses, but enough that you should keep them in mind. If you're ever having trouble, maybe try swapping to an elemental sub-weapon and seeing if they react uniquely to that. Something I really like about this series is that even though there's a lot of weapons that are just universally good, there are some that are just specifically meant to sort of be weaknesses for certain boss fights and enemies, and I like that. 0, 1 had this a little bit from memory, but 0, 2, and 3 just take it and run with it, especially with how I remember some of 3 systems working, particularly with the changed up G rifle. Using grenades here as well can be good in the case it's a further in piece of the nucleus, because then you might be able to just kind of lead a shot and hopefully hit it. If you start running low on health, though, this can definitely feel like a bit of a stressful boss fight, to say the least. On top of the fact that eventually they start closing in on you on multiple locations, and that's just a panic attack like nothing else. Oh yeah, that's the other major difference. If you actually, like, burn a lot of the goop away using the fire shots, the nucleuses actually do move slower, so you have more time to react. And for beating that, we get a notable new upgrade, the Burn Spark, a burning tackle attack. Activate with the sub-weapon button, press repeatedly to maintain speed. Burn Spark. This is the part I was looking for. We can increase GAIA-SOPHIA's energy output with this. That'll give Eve a steady supply of energy as well. It should be able to break through those security barriers too. I can't leave that behemoth free to rampage all over the place. This is a very interesting movement tool that's sort of like a speed booster out of Metroid a little bit. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 5 we're going to finish our duties here on L299 and see where we head after that. See you guys then.